Have you ever met someone who stays strangely calm in situations that make everyone else panic? A sudden argument breaks out, voices rise, tension spreads across the room, and while everyone else becomes visibly unsettled, one person remains quiet, composed, almost unreadable. At first glance, that kind of calm can feel intimidating. People often assume things about them, that they're emotionally distant, cold, too detached to care, or perhaps simply too independent to need anyone. But psychology often tells a more nuanced story, because sometimes calm is not the same thing as peace. Sometimes calm is not emotional stability in the way we imagine. Sometimes calm is practice survival. Some people do not react strongly to chaos because chaos feels strangely familiar. Their nervous system has spent so much time adapting to unpredictability that what unsettles others barely feels unusual to them. If you rarely panic, even when others do, if you trust people slowly, even when they seem kind, if you find yourself overthinking conversations long after they've ended, if being alone feels less lonely than being emotionally responsible for other people, if you often feel quietly responsible for keeping the emotional atmosphere around you stable, then this may explain something important. These patterns are often misunderstood, even by the people experiencing them. From the inside, they can feel like personality traits: being the strong one, being careful, being independent. But sometimes they are adaptations shaped by experiences the nervous system has not fully forgotten. And that distinction matters, because strength and survival often look identical from the outside. A person who appears emotionally controlled may actually be deeply exhausted. A person who seems distant may simply be protecting something fragile. A person who appears unusually self-sufficient may have learned long ago that relying on others felt unsafe. So in this conversation, we're going to explore what psychology suggests happens when someone has been through too much, and how certain traits that look like strength may actually be the quiet echoes of survival. One of the most misunderstood signs of someone who has been through significant emotional hardship is calmness. Not the gentle calm of genuine inner peace, but a quieter, more complicated kind. The kind that appears in moments when everyone else is visibly shaken. A crisis unfolds, tension rises, voices become sharper, uncertainty fills the room, and while others react with urgency, one person remains still. From the outside, this can look like emotional strength or emotional distance, but psychology offers another possibility. Sometimes what appears to be calm is actually a freeze response, a nervous system adaptation that develops when someone has spent too much time in environments where emotional chaos was unpredictable, overwhelming, or unavoidable. When people think about survival responses, they usually imagine fight or flight. But there is another response that receives less attention: freeze. When escape feels impossible and confrontation feels unsafe, the nervous system may learn to shut down emotional reactivity as a protective measure, not because the person feels nothing, but because feeling everything at once would be too much. If someone grew up in an environment where anger arrived suddenly, where emotional safety could disappear without warning, or where expressing fear made situations worse, their nervous system may have learned a different relationship with chaos. Not panic, observation, stillness, containment. Over time, this can become so automatic that even in adulthood, the body responds to stress not with visible distress, but with unusual composure. And this is where the paradox becomes important. Calm does not always mean safety. Sometimes it means the nervous system has seen worse. Sometimes the person who appears the most emotionally controlled is not the least affected, but the most practiced at suppressing outward reaction. Because when chaos becomes familiar, reacting intensely no longer feels useful. The mind learns efficiency, contain the emotion, assess the threat, stay functional. But surviving well and feeling safe are not the same thing. A person can appear calm while carrying enormous internal tension, which means what others interpret as strength may sometimes be something much more tender. A nervous system that learned, long ago, that emotional shutdown was the safest way to survive what could not be controlled. Another pattern often misunderstood as simple kindness is heightened empathy. You may have noticed this in certain people. They seem unusually quick to sense when something is wrong, even when nothing obvious has been said. They notice the slight hesitation in someone's voice, the smile that feels just a little too practiced, the subtle emotional shift in a room before anyone else seems aware of it. From the outside, this can look like emotional intelligence, and sometimes it is. But there is another possibility worth considering. Sometimes pain sharpens emotional radar. Not because suffering automatically makes people wiser or kinder, but because repeated emotional exposure can train the nervous system to become exceptionally sensitive to subtle cues. A person who has spent years navigating unpredictable emotional environments often becomes highly skilled at pattern recognition. The mind learns to connect small signals with larger outcomes. A particular tone of voice may once have meant anger was coming. A certain silence may have preceded rejection. A forced smile may have hidden emotional volatility. Over time, the brain begins noticing these patterns automatically. There is also something psychologists sometimes describe as emotional mirroring, the tendency to unconsciously tune into and reflect the emotional states of others. For someone shaped by instability, this can become a survival strategy. Reading other people accurately once may have helped them stay safe, and this is where the interpretation becomes important. What looks like compassion may not be kindness alone. Sometimes it is conditioning, a form of survival empathy. The ability to detect distress, discomfort, or emotional tension quickly because the nervous system learned that noticing feelings early had protective value. This does not make the empathy less real, but it does change how we understand it. Because some people care deeply for others, not only because they are naturally nurturing, but because their own history taught them to become emotionally fluent for survival. They learn to read moods before words, to sense emotional weather before the storm arrived. And while this sensitivity can create extraordinary compassion, it can also be exhausting. Because when your nervous system is constantly tuned to the emotional frequencies of others, empathy stops being a choice. It becomes a reflex. For some people, heightened sensitivity does not simply lead to empathy, it leads to responsibility, or at least the feeling of responsibility. The unspoken belief that it is somehow their job to keep the emotional atmosphere around them stable. If tension rises in a room, they notice immediately. If two people begin drifting toward conflict, they feel it before anyone says a word. And often, without fully realizing it, they step in. They soften the conversation, change the subject, make a joke, offer reassurance, absorb discomfort. From the outside, this can look like emotional maturity or generosity, but psychologically, there may be something deeper happening. This pattern is often connected to what trauma psychology describes as the fawning response. Most people are familiar with fight, flight, or freeze. But fawning is another survival adaptation, one rooted in appeasement. When someone learns, consciously or unconsciously, that direct conflict feels unsafe, the nervous system may adopt a strategy of keeping others emotionally regulated in order to maintain personal safety. In simple terms, if everyone else stays calm, maybe I will be safe too. And so emotional management becomes a form of protection, not because the person wants control, but because peace feels necessary. This can appear in subtle ways, constantly checking if others are upset, apologizing quickly even when nothing is clearly wrong, feeling uncomfortable when others are disappointed, becoming the mediator, the peacemaker, the one who quietly carries emotional tension so no one else has to. And this is where the paradox becomes painful. They may spend so much time protecting others emotionally that they lose contact with their own emotional needs. Because when your attention is always directed outward, inward awareness becomes harder. What do you need? What are you feeling? What would happen if you stopped managing everyone else? For many people shaped by this pattern, those questions feel surprisingly unfamiliar, because protecting others was never only about kindness, it was about safety. And when safety becomes linked to emotional caretaking, rest becomes difficult. Because peace no longer feels like something you receive. It becomes something you feel responsible for creating. There is another pattern that often goes unnoticed, because it can look so ordinary from the outside. Watch where some people choose to sit in a restaurant, rarely with their back to the door, usually somewhere with a clear view of the entrance. Not because they are consciously suspicious, not because they expect something dramatic to happen, but because some part of the nervous system quietly prefers visibility, control, preparation, or notice how quickly they react to sound. A door closing too hard, sudden footsteps behind them, a raised voice in another room. What barely registers for others can create an immediate shift in the body. Tightened muscles, a racing heart, sharpened attention. Sometimes they enter a new environment and instinctively scan it without realizing. Who is here? Where is the exit? What feels safe? What doesn't? From the outside, these behaviors may seem like personality quirks, being observant, being careful, being detail-oriented. But psychologically, they often point towards something deeper, a nervous system that has become highly practiced at anticipating threat. When someone has spent enough time in environments where safety felt uncertain, The body can begin operating as though danger is always a possibility, even long after the original circumstances have changed. This is hypervigilance, not fear in the dramatic sense, but persistent readiness, a nervous system that never fully exits survival mode. And one of the cruelest aspects of this state is that it becomes normal. The person may not even realize how much internal effort is being spent simply monitoring the world. Because when alertness becomes familiar, calm can feel strangely foreign. Relaxation may feel uncomfortable. Stillness may create unease rather than relief. The body has learned that lowering vigilance is risky. So even in objectively safe spaces, true rest remains difficult. And this changes more than daily stress levels. Because a nervous system that struggles to feel safe in ordinary environments often struggles with emotional safety too. Which means hypervigilance does not stay confined to rooms, sounds, or exits. Eventually it enters relationships, and this changes how they love. When a person has learned that closeness can lead to pain, trust begins to feel very different. Not impossible, but expensive. This is one of the quieter consequences of betrayal memory. The emotional imprint left behind when trust has previously been met with abandonment, rejection, manipulation, or emotional harm. The mind remembers experiences, but so does the nervous system, which means even when a new person appears kind, emotionally available, or trustworthy, some deeper part of the body may remain cautious, not because the present person has done something wrong, but because the past taught an enduring lesson. Vulnerability can be dangerous. This is how emotional walls are built. Not out of arrogance, not because someone lacks feeling, but because openness once carried consequences the nervous system does not want to repeat. And these walls can be surprisingly subtle. They may share stories, laugh with you, show kindness, even stay loyal. Yet somehow there remains a quiet distance, an invisible threshold you can sense but never quite cross. Psychologically, this often connects to attachment trauma, experiences where emotional closeness became associated with unpredictability, disappointment, or hurt rather than safety. When attachment itself becomes linked with pain, intimacy creates conflict. Part of the person longs for connection. Another part remains vigilant, protective, prepared. And this creates a painful paradox. They may care deeply, perhaps more deeply than they show, but still remain emotionally unreachable. Because caring and trusting are not always the same process. You can love someone and still fear depending on them. You can crave closeness and still instinctively pull away when it becomes real. For some, emotional distance is not rejection, it is protection, a way of maintaining enough space to survive disappointment if it comes. But of course, this protection comes with its own cost, because relationships require a degree of emotional risk. And when safety depends on never becoming too vulnerable, connection can only go so far. The tragedy is that the very strategies designed to prevent heartbreak can quietly create a different kind of loneliness. The loneliness of being deeply connected to others on the surface, while keeping the most fragile parts of yourself permanently out of reach. For some people, overthinking is not simply a habit. It is a form of protection. From the outside, it may look like excessive analysis, reading too much into a text message, replaying conversations long after they end, preparing for possibilities that may never happen. But internally, the logic often feels very different. If I think through every possible outcome, maybe nothing will catch me off guard. This is what psychologists sometimes describe as mental rehearsal, the mind's attempt to reduce emotional risk by pre-living potential scenarios before they happen. A message arrives with a shorter tone than usual. No emoji. A delayed reply. The mind begins filling in possibilities. Are they upset? Did I say something wrong? Is something changing? At work, a manager's neutral expression after a meeting becomes difficult to ignore. A small ambiguity expands. Is there bad news coming? Did I make a mistake? Am I missing something? In relationships, uncertainty becomes especially activating. Silence feels loaded. Distance feels meaningful. Ambiguity feels emotionally unsafe. Part of this comes from catastrophic anticipation, the tendency to mentally prepare for worst-case scenarios as a way of minimizing future shock. Part comes from uncertainty intolerance. For nervous systems shaped by unpredictability, not knowing can feel more distressing than bad news itself. At least certainty, even painful certainty, feels containable. And then there is cognitive over-control, the belief that enough thinking can somehow create safety, that analysis can prevent emotional pain, that preparation can eliminate vulnerability. But there is a quiet paradox here. The mind overthinks in order to create peace. Yet overthinking often destroys the very peace it seeks. because life does not become safer simply because it has been mentally rehearsed 100 times. The body still carries the stress. The emotional system still remains activated. And eventually, the person becomes exhausted not by what is happening, but by what might happen. Overthinking, in this sense, is rarely about drama. It is often an exhausted nervous system trying to create certainty in a world that once felt painfully unpredictable. After enough chaos, a person's definition of happiness often changes. For some people, excitement feels desirable, novelty feels energizing, uncertainty feels adventurous. But for someone who has spent long periods living in emotional unpredictability, the nervous system often begins wanting something very different. Not intensity, not stimulation, not surprise, peace, predictability, routine. A quiet day feels luxurious to someone who grew up expecting disruption. This can be difficult for others to understand. From the outside, a preference for routine may seem overly cautious, even unimaginative. The same morning coffee, the same familiar route home, the same restaurants, the same rhythms. But psychologically, repetition can feel profoundly regulating, because routine offers something chaos never did: reliability. When life has taught you that emotional environments can shift without warning, predictability becomes deeply comforting. Knowing what comes next allows the nervous system to soften. Not completely, but enough to breathe. This is what stability craving often reflects. Not rigidity for its own sake, but a longing for internal safety. A nervous system that has spent too much time adapting to uncertainty often becomes deeply attached to environments that feel emotionally manageable. A calm home, a structured day, relationships with clear expectations. Even boredom can begin to feel soothing, because boredom in this context does not mean emptiness. It means nothing alarming is happening, and that can feel like relief. There is a quiet grief hidden here too, because people shaped by chaos sometimes struggle to enjoy the very spontaneity others associate with freedom. Last-minute changes may create disproportionate stress. Ambiguity may feel draining rather than exciting. Emotional unpredictability may feel intolerable, not because they are inflexible, but because their nervous system associates unpredictability with emotional cost. And so what looks, from the outside, like a preference for a small life may actually be something much more human. A deep desire to finally experience consistency, to wake up without preparing for disruption, to move through a day without waiting for something to go wrong. For someone who has spent years surviving storms, peace does not feel boring, it feels extraordinary. For some people, being alone does not feel like loneliness, it feels like relief. After spending years monitoring emotional atmospheres, anticipating other people's needs, managing tension, or staying internally alert, solitude can become one of the few places where the nervous system finally begins to soften. No one to read, no moods to interpret, no emotional undercurrents to navigate, no pressure to stay available, accommodating, or emotionally prepared. Just quiet. And for someone whose internal world has been shaped by prolonged stress, that quiet can feel deeply restorative. Being alone becomes less about withdrawal and more about recovery. A way to recharge a nervous system that has spent too long running in the background. But over time, this preference for solitude can begin blending with something else. Extreme independence. The belief that handling everything alone is simply easier, safer, more efficient. At first, this can look like strength. The person who never asks for help, who manages crises quietly, who solves their own problems, who says, "I'm fine," and often appears to mean it. But psychological independence is not always the same thing as emotional freedom. Sometimes it is protection, because dependence requires trust, and trust requires vulnerability. For someone who has learned that relying on others can lead to disappointment, abandonment, or emotional pain, self-sufficiency becomes more than a personality trait. It becomes armor. If I need no one can let me down. If I carry everything myself, nothing important is placed in uncertain hands. And this is where the paradox becomes especially poignant. What begins as freedom can slowly become emotional isolation, because independence can absolutely be healthy. But when it becomes the only safe option, something changes. Support starts feeling uncomfortable. Receiving care feels unfamiliar. Even genuine closeness can feel strangely intrusive. The person may deeply long for connection while simultaneously finding dependence intolerable. So solitude becomes both sanctuary and prison, a place of peace and a place of distance. Because the hardest truth is this: sometimes the people who seem strongest alone are not the ones who need others the least. They may simply be the ones who learned earliest that needing others felt dangerous. There is a kind of sadness that does not look like sadness. It does not always cry. It does not necessarily stay in bed. It does not announce itself dramatically. In fact, it often looks remarkably functional. The person goes to work, replies to messages, shows up to birthdays, laughs at the right moments, pays bills, keeps routines. From the outside, life appears intact. And yet, beneath that functioning surface, there may be a quieter emotional reality, a kind of functional sadness. Not always depression in the clinical sense, but a persistent emotional fatigue that settles into the background of a person's inner life. A tiredness that is not solved by sleep. Because it is not physical exhaustion alone, it is emotional wear. The accumulated weight of carrying too much for too long. Some people become extraordinarily skilled at masking pain, not because they are trying to deceive others, but because emotional concealment once became adaptive. If vulnerability was ignored, punished, or made unsafe, then learning to appear fine becomes a deeply practiced response. And after enough repetition, even the person themselves may lose clear access to what they actually feel. The sadness becomes quieter, less dramatic, more existential. Not sharp pain, fog, a diffuse heaviness. A sense that something inside feels chronically tired in ways language struggles to fully describe. This is where existential weariness often emerges. Not simply sadness about a specific event, but a deeper fatigue that comes from prolonged emotional burden. From seeing too much, carrying too much, expecting too much of yourself for too long. And perhaps one of the loneliest aspects of this kind of pain is how invisible it can be. Because the world often recognizes breakdown, it notices obvious suffering. But quiet endurance can go completely unseen. The person who seems the most composed may be the one privately carrying the greatest emotional weight. And perhaps that is what makes this kind of sadness so difficult. It does not interrupt life loudly enough for others to notice. It simply changes the emotional texture of living, until joy feels more muted, rest feels incomplete, and even meaningful moments are experienced through a thin emotional distance, as though part of the self never fully arrives. After everything we've explored, it would be easy to leave the story here, in exhaustion, hypervigilance, emotional distance, and quiet sadness. But that would be incomplete, because while pain can wound, it can also change the way a person understands life. Not always for the better, not automatically, and certainly not in a simple, inspirational way. Suffering does not guarantee growth. Some pain remains unresolved. Some experiences leave scars that continue to shape relationships, self-worth, and emotional safety for years. But sometimes something else happens. Sometimes pain deepens a person, not because suffering is inherently noble, but because surviving difficult experiences can alter perception in lasting ways. A person who has known loneliness may become unusually sensitive to the loneliness of others, not out of theory, but recognition. This is where empathy can become deeper, not performative kindness, but a quieter ability to sense what others may not be saying. Pain can also create resilience, though not in the romanticized sense of becoming invincible. More often, resilience looks like emotional endurance, the ability to remain present with discomfort, to keep functioning through uncertainty, to understand that difficult feelings, however intense, are survivable. There is also discernment. People who have experienced betrayal, instability, or emotional complexity often become more thoughtful about character, boundaries, and emotional patterns. Not because they are cynical, but because experience has taught them nuance. And perhaps most quietly, pain can create meaning-making. The human mind has a remarkable tendency to search for coherence after suffering, to ask difficult questions, to reconstruct identity, to decide, consciously or unconsciously, what hardship will mean. This does not erase the cost of pain. It does not justify suffering. But it acknowledges something psychologically honest. Some people emerge from hardship with a deeper understanding of themselves, others, and life itself. Not lighter, but wiser. Not untouched, but more emotionally awake. And perhaps that is one of the most complex truths about suffering. It can break people, it can harden people, but sometimes in quieter ways, it can also deepen them. If you've recognized yourself in any part of this conversation, perhaps the most important thing to understand is this. What we often call strength is not always what it appears to be. From the outside, surviving hardship can look admirable. The calm under pressure, the emotional self-control, the independence, the ability to keep going no matter what. And sometimes, those qualities do reflect genuine resilience. But sometimes they reflect something more complicated, because strength built from survival often comes with invisible costs. The ability to stay calm may come from learning to emotionally shut down. Independence may come from discovering that relying on others once felt unsafe. Empathy may come from years of hyper-awareness. Overthinking may be the mind's attempt to prevent old pain from returning. In other words, some forms of strength are less about thriving and more about adaptation. That does not make them any less real, but it does invite a more compassionate understanding. You are not weak for carrying these patterns, and you are not flawed because certain parts of you became organized around protection. The human nervous system is remarkably intelligent in the ways it tries to keep us safe. But protection and healing are not always the same thing. What helps us survive one chapter of life may quietly limit us in another, and recognizing that is not self-criticism, it is awareness. So here's the question I want you to sit with. Are you truly strong, or have you simply become someone who learned that softness was unsafe? There is no shame in either answer, because for many people, emotional guardedness was not a conscious choice, it was a response. A way of adapting to environments that required more from the nervous system than should ever have been necessary. But if that adaptation still shapes how you trust, rest, connect, or receive care, then perhaps the question is no longer how well you survived. Perhaps the question becomes whether survival is still the life your mind believes you are living. And if any of this felt familiar, I'd be genuinely interested to hear your thoughts. Which part resonated with you most? The hypervigilance, the overthinking, the quiet sadness, the need for independence, the exhaustion of always keeping everyone else okay. Sometimes the simple act of naming a pattern is where something begins to shift, and sometimes being understood is the first form of safety. Deep Ravines Lab Protocol. Characters and stories are AI-generated for motivational insights. 2. Content is curated for entertainment and exploring the messiness of human psyche. 3. No proselytizing or harmful content.